for the invitation to speak today. Um, and especially actually to return to something that I worked on a few years ago and that we published a paper on in 2023. I've actually given a few talks on this subject before, and it's been really fun to actually go back and look at what I said before and then think about what I could maybe add to it for this talk and what new things I could come up with to talk about, especially now that I have a little bit of distance from the work that we did on it previously. So there's some familiar faces here. It's great to see some of these names. And what I'm going to be talking about are the rather famous mammoth bone structures that are found in Eastern Europe. And I want to give a little bit of historical context for them. I want to just talk about sort of the traditional way that they've been interpreted. Then talk about some of the revisions of these ideas that have taken place over the last few years. And finally, I just want to kind of broaden it out a little bit and see how these structures are actually possibly even more interesting than I'd realized about a week ago before I started looking at them again. I think they actually there's so much that we can learn from them, and so many different interesting routes we could go down to study them. So let me just see. There we go. All right. So I'm going to start with a picture from a site called Mezhyrich, which is in modern day Ukraine. And this is, just such a wonderful photograph from the excavations. And you can see this, absolutely remarkable accumulation and construction of mammoth bones, with the mandibles all around the edges, built up in these like chevron patterns all linked together. And you can see also the scale of the thing, which is, really quite remarkable. The sites that I'm going to be talking about, I think, it is important to note just how visually striking they are, and just how substantial they are, because we don't really see anything else quite like this, I think, in Upper Paleolithic Europe. There is something really very special about them, and I think just because we've seen all these things before, most of us, it is just important to just remember actually, how phenomenal it is that we have this kind of evidence from the Ice Age. Now, apart from the site of Mezhyrich, we also have examples from, for example, the site of, so to go back, so just some more pictures then from Mezhyrich, and you can see so that there are actually multiple examples from the same site of Mezhyrich. So there's three plan drawings there of some of the accumulations that were found, and from early on, these accumulations began to be interpreted as a result of, or as the remains of, dwelling structures. And so these were, reconstructed, like quite literally, like in museum settings and so on, as these dwellings made out of mammoth bones, made out of tusks. And the idea is that these were like quite permanent dwelling structures where people could shelter from the cold during this quite cold part of the last ice age. And were supposed to have been covered. They're supposed to have been hard inside. There's supposed to have been, activities going on inside them. Other examples are known, for example, from the site of Mezin, for example, also in Ukraine. And again, you can see the reconstructions, the reconstruction of the site as somewhere where there was a dwelling structure that that was then, subsequently collapsed. And that's how you got this pile of mammoth bones there. Apart from the sites more in the west, we also have one site further east at Kostyanki 11. Kostyanki, of course, is a very important locality for the Upper Paleolithic. There's, I think, 26 or 27 sites now recognized at Kostyanki. And at just one of them do we have these mammoth bone structures. So this is one of the older ones that was excavated, and they left it in situ with a pavilion built on top of it, which you can still visit today. And you can actually see around the edges there how it has a very similar arrangement to the site at Mezhirich. You can see the mandibles around the edges. And most recently, so this is just outside the pavilion, there's been an absolutely huge, I think it's 13 or 14 meters across, this one. An absolutely huge example that's been under very recent excavation. And I have to say, I visited the site a few years ago, and when you stand in the middle of it and you look around you and there's just mammoth bones everywhere, and you look at them a little bit more closely and you can kind of see how some of them are slotted together and so on. It is, certainly one of the most, impressive things that I've seen, as an archaeologist studying the Upper Paleolithic. It is, just really quite mind-blowing, to me, that we have this kind of structure, which I think is important because, as I'm going to talk again about, towards the end of the talk, the sort of the impressiveness of these structures is actually possibly quite important to interpreting them and to understanding why they were built and how they might have sort of functioned, as part of the landscape and as part of the social and worldview kind of system of the people who built them. All right. So to give you an idea of the geographical distribution of these sites, apart from the one at Kostyanki, which is there to the east on the Don, the sites that we know of are found basically within the Dnieper drainage basin, so Desna around the river Desna and the river Dnieper, and so they're the ones that I've circled there in blue. There's a few other sites that I've marked, which are in Central Europe, further to the west, and I've just marked them just because I want to mention that apart from these sites, we also know of many sites where there are very substantial mammoth bone accumulations, but which date to the mid-Upper Paleolithic. So just to give you a little, I'm not going to talk about them any further in this talk, but just to give you a little bit of context, that this is not the first time in the Upper Paleolithic that we are aware of people having, made large accumulations of mammoth bones at sites. So there's a whole earlier phenomenon of this happening during the mid-Upper Paleolithic, which, found it, multiple Gravettian sites, which is important. And if anyone's interested in them, I would refer you to the work of Martin Oliva, who's done some really interesting work looking at the reinterpretation of these and how we might see them. And actually, a lot of that work kind of dovetails very nicely with some of the stuff that I'm going to be talking about today. So I just wanted to signpost that and just to give you that little bit of context. But in terms of the sites that I'm going to be talking about today, they're very much found within a restricted geographical area, and all, apart from Kostyanki, all found within this one river drainage basin system. So dating wise, it's very interesting straight away to show you that the site that geographically is apart from the other sites is also considerably earlier than the other sites. So we have one site which is dated to sort of the beginning of the LGM. You know, I mean, the LGM does not have a simple the LGM does not have a simple definition that is shared all the way across Europe. You know, it doesn't go from like X to X years. Okay, so but if we, you know, we're talking about like late GS3 and like Greenland Stadial 3. And so that's Kostyanki 11. And then all the other sites that are found in the Desna Dnieper River Basin, they probably date to around about 18,000 calendrical years ago. Some of them are better dated than others. Okay, and so the issue with these sites is that often we have a huge number of radiocarbon dates for them, but they're not necessarily very reliable. They're often on you know, material like such as burnt bone that, you know, we've often had issues with in the past. There's often huge spreads of dates which don't really make sense, and so often the large spreads of dates have sometimes been interpreted as being the result of ivory or bone being picked up in the landscape that was scavenged from, you know, long dead mammoths and then brought back to the site. I'm not really sure, for reasons that we'll go into, I'm not really sure that that's, you know, a good explanation for the large spreads of dates that we see. And so I think certainly other specialists at the moment would suggest that the sites probably all date to quite a tight period of time, quite a short period of time, somewhere around about 18,000 calibrated years ago, which places it, you know, towards the just kind of just after the LGM as it's usually defined, but still in Greenland Stadial 2. So it's, you know, still very cold periods, but it might be kind of after the sort of the worst peak of the LGM. And I will come back to that again a little bit later on, because there's some interesting stuff to say about that and about the gap that we have between these two phases. Now, all right, so as I said already, the consensus on these structures has been for a long time that they were the remains of dwellings. There is a whole history of how this came to be. It has a lot to do with just Soviet archaeological history. The sort of context that people were working in then, the theoretical context that people were working in then. But I think it's, you know, it's fair to say that this interpretation has been very widely accepted, has been, you know, really enthusiastically adopted, you know, all over the world as the interpretation of these sites. I mean, it's just awesome to think of, you know, people were building these houses out of mammoth bone and you know, out of tusks, and like, wow, they look amazing in museums, they look amazing in drawings of reconstructions, and so I think both, you know, both archaeologically and for the wider public, this is an idea that, you know, was really very well accepted, very you know, very little questioned, I think, for many decades. I think it's worth noting, of course, that, you know, a lot of the primary literature on these sites, if not all the primary literature on these sites, basically is in either Russian or Ukrainian, and so it's not necessarily been accessible to a wider audience to actually go back to primary literature and look at these things. But, you know, so certainly the interpretation, I think, has been very widely accepted everywhere. And so the idea was that people were building these structures out of mammoth bones. The question of whether or not they were from mammoths that were hunted, you know, was something that I think there was a lot of doubt over for a long time. So the idea was that these were from the remains of mammoths that had been often scavenged out of the landscape. So as I mentioned before, in relation to the radiocarbon dates, um, that was how things were often seen. Um, but there are issues with this interpretation. All right, and so this has only really, I think, come to light sort of in kind of serious scholarly um, discourse in like the last decades. But there's been, quite a lot of rethinking now of this idea, which has started with some of my Russian colleagues. So Konstantin Gavrilov, who some of you may know as the excavator of Kotilova 2, and a well-regarded specialist in Russia on the Upper Paleolithic, returned to these sites and started looking, I think, more critically at the theoretical kind of context in which they were being interpreted as the results of as remains of dwellings, and also looking at the taphonomy of these sites with a little bit more of a critical eye, and asking, okay, is it actually possible that what we're seeing here on the ground, that this could be, where there was a roof that then collapsed? Because that's the basic idea. The basic idea is that you have a dwelling, it had a roof, the roof was made out of mammoth bones, and then it collapsed, and that's why you have this circle of mammoth bones and tusks and so on. And to cut a long story short, he wrote this great, it's a very good, very long article in Russian, which really kind of took this apart from a theoretical and from practical taphonomic view. Then later on, so that was then, and then a few years later, came out and said outright that he does not think that the accumulations are the result of a collapse. That the way that the bones were found is that they're more or less in situ, so that they were found in a sort of one layer arrangement, and that's how they were left in prehistory. So that the original structure was not roofed, was not curved, was not curved and held up like that. It was built flat on the ground, and that, of course, that is completely at odds with the interpretation of these structures as having been the remains of dwellings. From outside of Russia, there's also been a return to looking at these sites, and so Alex Pryor, who many of you will know, based in Exeter, has done some work directly on the recently excavated site of Kostronki 11 1A, so the last one that I showed you earlier on. And he and his colleagues argued again that the feature there is not a dwelling structure. And he had so multiple lines of evidence for saying this. And I think probably one of the most straightforward ones is just that it's just too big. It's just too big to understand how it could possibly have been a roofed, how they could possibly have built any kinds of structure to hold up a roof made out of bones at this size. I mean, some of the other sites, you're looking at something that's maybe 3-4 meters across, but at Kostronki 11 1A, you're looking at something that's 12.5 meters across. And there's a lot more detail in his article, but he argues, I think, quite plausibly that it's not a dwelling structure. They in that paper, they floated an idea that it might be something to do with food storage, which is really interesting, and I would I would love to know actually how much further how much further they've taken this idea. And so yeah, it'll be interesting to see if anything else comes out of that. But so that's just one of the alternative of ideas that's been put forward in recent years. Um, but I want to talk a little bit more in detail now just about the site of Udinova, because this is a site um, that I think is quite important to the debate. It's formed the basis of quite a lot of the rethinking. So done by for example Konstantin Gavrilov, and Gennady Klopchov, and other colleagues in Russia. Is quite important for that, and it's also this is the site where the paper that I published with Mikhail Sablin and colleagues is largely based around this site. And so it's in the the main distribution of sites on the not just off the Desna. There are, I think, 5 different accumulations found at the site. So five separate accumulations of mammoth bones that were identified and excavated. You can see here again that it's so like at Kastranki 11, they built what they call a pavilion over the top of it, and preserved it in situ. And then there's other excavations then that are that have gone on outside of the pavilion. There's actually been very recent excavations also have been carried out at the site. And it is, I don't know, to be honest, when I look at this, I mean, I visited it, like I took that photo like when I visited it a few years ago, quite a few years ago, and I'm not totally sure. I mean, like it's obviously been cleaned quite a lot around all the mammoth bone accumulation. So I think it might have looked a little bit yeah, there might have been a slightly less clean distribution of bones at one point. But anyway, there are very quite very clearly, like when you look at all the plan drawings and so on, there are these 5 separate round accumulations of mammoth bones that have been identified there. Dating wise, if you take a critical eye to the radiocarbon dates that have been published for the site, it falls into this period around about 18,000 calibrated years BP. It falls into what we call Epigravatian, which is a extremely poorly understood cultural taxon, which basically is what we call everything LGM and post LGM in this part of the world. But yeah, we're looking at backed bladelets. I mean, beyond that, from a lithic point of view, it's not been very well described. I think there's a lot of work that I think could still probably be done to understand the lithic industries from these sites. But yeah, that's where we are for now with it. As far as the faunal assemblage goes, it is mostly mammoth. There's also quite a lot of Arctic fox there. And as with other sites, it's mostly adults, female mammoths, and juveniles that are found. Although I think there's a few males in there as well, but it's mainly the adult females that were being hunted. The understanding is, I think, generally with mammoths that they lived in these, we assume these matriarchal herds, like elephants do today. And the adult males were mostly sort of roaming around, pretty much solo. But the herds where the babies were being brought up were these sort of arrangements where there was adult females living together. And apart from that, at Udinova, we have some interesting areas, where different activities and so on have been identified at the site. So there were things. There were certainly lots of different types of activities that were being carried out in the immediate vicinity of these structures. All right. So yeah, just to give you an idea of the layout of the site. So to give you an idea of the size, I guess that's looking at an area of something like 30 meters by 30 meters, something like that. So like it's a considerable it's a considerable area that's been excavated and that has where these structures have been found. It's very, very close to the modern day river. It's on a sort of a promontory, so just up above the level of the modern day river. And apart from the lithics and so on, excuse me, that have been found, there's been some really amazing finds of ivory artifacts and so on, which I'm not able to go into in further detail today. But yeah, just to say that there's been, all kinds of results of ivory working that have also been found at the site, and some really remarkable finds there. Also some shells that have probably come quite a long distance that were found there. Now, I'm just going to draw your attention here okay, so each of these ones is something like maybe 4 meters across. So they're not absolutely huge. They're not like the ones I was showing you at Kostonki 11, or even I think the one from Mezhirich. But they look something like this. And so you can see, for example, if you look at the very bottom of the picture and structure number 4 there at the bottom of the screen, you can actually see these lines of vertebrae that are stacked up there in anatomical position. I'll show you another picture of them in a minute. You can also maybe pick out in the picture of structure number 3, sort of in the middle towards the bottom of the picture, you can see where there's a mammoth skull that's been placed sort of with its sort of face down. Okay, because you can see it's 1430, the back of the molars there. And you can, if you look carefully, you can start picking out all kinds of different bones that are there. There's, scapulae, long bones, all kinds of things. Now, to move on. So yeah, just to stress the fact that we do have bones there that are found in anatomical position, which is also found certainly at other sites, so certainly Mezhirich, for example. And so we know that bones were being put into this accumulation and they still had meat on them, they still had tendons on them. They if they'd been scavenged from the landscape, they were scavenged very, very quickly after the mammoths died. But the other lines of evidence, are strongly indicative of the fact that the mammoth remains that are represented here are from hunted mammoths. So if you look at the age profile, we see that it's not a profile from natural mortality. We can also look at the deliberate smashing of brain cases, presumably to get at, the brains that can be used for tanning, for whatever you might want to do with them, but which again you need to do that very quickly. And there's also, by the way, there's in many of the scapulae there are deliberate perforations which are interpreted as the result of them being having some sort of rope or attachment or something put through them so that they could be dragged or carried back to the site from where the mammoth was killed. All right. On the question of mammoth hunting, so back when I was an undergraduate, which I recently realized was 20 years ago, the question of whether mammoths were actually hunted during the Upper Paleolithic was still kind of a hot potato. And in the years, kind of this is something I managed to kind of see developing, through the years since I've started studying archaeology. And so like some of the earliest direct evidence for mammoth hunting came from Siberia, so the site of Lugaskoye, which people were like a little bit iffy about, but then we started finding like more and more examples of these mammoth bones that had projectile points still embedded in them. And I don't think we're going to do better than that in terms of evidence for hunting. So, for example, from site of Kostyanki 14, and this one dates to the very, very beginning of the Upper Paleolithic, we have a mammoth ivory point embedded in a mammoth bone. From the site of Krakow-Spadzista, which dates to the mid Upper Paleolithic. Again, we have this is the tip of a flint point, which was found embedded in the mammoth bone. So the question of whether or not people were hunting mammoth at the time, I think, should be pretty much settled. This is something that we now have very good evidence for. Just to return a little bit to the arrangements of crania. So this is just another picture of how the skulls were very often embedded in the or how they were found embedded in the sediment anyway, at the site. And so it's this very specific and not accidental, I would say, arrangement where the sorry, this is where my tusks would go if I had tusks. Where you can see that the what do you call them, alveoli of the mammoths, they've been put directly vertically, and so often these are also kind of arranged in sort of little circles, kind of facing each other. And it's quite a striking feature of the arrangements of mammoth bones found at Udinova. Okay, so for a whole host of reasons, we have reason to believe that these are not the remains of dwellings, despite the fact that that was the traditional interpretation. The just general taphonomy, the general arrangements of the bones, it's just not consistent with the idea that they were dwellings. At Udinova, often there's no hearths found inside the structures. Again, the fact that often the bones weren't defleshed, and so obviously you can build something with meaty bones, but it raises questions. And there's nothing that looks like a floor area found inside these so-called dwellings, which of course then raises the question of what were they. And so we went into this in the paper that we published in 2023. And so what we talked about in the 2023 paper was a development of something that Mikhail Sablin had noted in a previous paper about the Udinova bones, where he had drawn an analogy with the ethnographically attested examples of middening found in Siberia and Japan. And he pointed out that there's quite complex activities that are connected. So for example, if you know anything about the Ainu bear cults in Japan, the way that they dispose of the bones, after the bear has been killed and so on, there's very strict rules about how this is done. They leave quite an interesting physical signature afterwards. And so he'd already made this observation, and so then in the 2023 paper we expanded it a lot more. And the main line of argument that we went down was about ritualized middening. And so if you start looking into the archaeological and the ethnographic literature, there are so many examples of from all over the world, from all time periods, of people treating the remains of the animals that they've hunted, especially large animals, treating them in a very special way and disposing of those remains in a very formalized manner. Um, often I think this is important. There's special attention is paid to the heads or to the skulls. Okay, so this kind of idea of seeing that the head or the skull as being particularly important. This is something that comes up again and again. I don't think it's very difficult to understand why that might be the case, but it is something that we have a lot of evidence for from all over the place. Now, there is a great series of papers by McNiven, based particularly on his work looking at dugong bone middens in the Torres Strait Islands, where he talks about, okay, so what is it that makes these middens in particular special? Like what differentiates them from just regular middens? And so he comes up with these three elements that he thinks are particularly important, which he calls, first of all, referencing, which is the inclusion of kind of special or symbolically important material that isn't, which isn't, the animal bones themselves, but stuff like personal ornaments, stuff like special raw materials, and which is also found inside of the middens often. He talks about discrimination. So the idea that, only certain species of animals are treated in this way, and also that, physically they might be arranged in very, very particular ways. Which obviously has a very clear analogy at Eudinova and at the other sites with Mammoth-bone structures. And then thirdly, he talks about mounding, which is, so deliberately creating mounds out of the remains that is something that's remains visible afterwards and can often become quite impressive and that, remains there for a long time. Which again, you can see that potentially has correspondences with what we see at Eudinova and elsewhere. Now, with regard to referencing, I just want to say that is also attested at Eudinova, because we have, for example, all kinds of personal ornaments as, ivory artifacts, occasional bones of other animals, but things like, for example, a fox skull I mentioned there. And what's really interesting is the fact that often these are found like in kind of unexpected places with relation to the mammoth skulls. So often like inside the mouth cavity, inside the tusk cavities. And this is something that's been well known for a long time, that there was all these other kinds of unexpected things coming out of these mammoth bone structures and in places that we weren't necessarily, you wouldn't necessarily expect to see them. Okay, so this is kind of a striking fact, certainly at Eudinova. Okay, with regards to burial, so previous work by Micha German-Prey and colleagues found that she's a zooarchaeologist, so she worked on the bones from this site. She found that they were probably buried very soon after they were constructed, because there's just very little gnawing or weathering or anything on the bones. And also the painted structures that are found at Mezin and Mezerich, for example, it's very unlikely that the paint could have survived for a long time in the open. Okay, so it's quite possible that these might have been buried deliberately with sediments after, soon after the bones were put together. Okay, all that said, I think it has to be acknowledged that we don't have full consensus on this rethink of the structures as not being the remains of dwelling structures. I don't want to pick out anyone in particular, because I don't know what people's like current thinking is on this subject exactly. But I am aware that like there are multiple specialists who are still arguing that these are dwelling structures, or at least that some of them were dwelling structures. And so I think there's debate still to be had there. It's it's not like there's been a simple switch from one consensus to another. There's going to be conversations to be had about this that I think are going to go on for some time. And I don't think that I don't think I can resolve that, but I think I can just mention a few sort of questions or kind of or routes that would be useful to go down to start kind of piecing out, whether or not some of them were Indian dwelling structures, because I certainly can't exclude that, at some sites that some of the remains that we're seeing were dwelling structures. But I think that it can't be seen as a foregone conclusion anymore that they were. So some people have recently looked at doing dating work to try and improve our understanding of the structures, which is, to my mind, is always welcome. To me, though, I find it difficult to see how this can be conclusive in deciding between one idea or the other. But there's a paper it's under open peer review at the moment by Wei Chu and colleagues, which looks at that. I think we could just also have a better idea of if we could maybe go back to the primary literature on these structures and just have a better understanding of what are the specifics of each structure, how are they different, how are they similar, and so on. We could certainly also have better taphonomic studies. So despite the fact that they're old excavations, I think we can go back and even just based on the descriptions and the photographs that we do have, it would be just really good to just take a critical eye to each structure and say, okay, well, how does this work? I would mention just specifically that I have often seen the argument that because you have what may be the results of kind of domestic activities, which are found within these structures, that this therefore demonstrates that they were indeed dwellings. But for me, that association is not entirely reliable, because you could easily have an area where any kind of activity was carried out, and then later a structure was built on top of it. So it's very difficult for me to see how you can definitely tie together the structure with the activity that's attested in a layer then within it. And then actually what might be really interesting to do, and I think hasn't really been done as much, is to actually go back and maybe do a bit of experimental archaeology, and say, okay, so let's try and build a structure like this, and what happens. Okay, so I'm just going to, in the light of everything that I've said, I'm just going to show you a few pictures of the structures again, and so you can just look at them and kind of think to yourself whether you find the arguments that I've just put forward persuasive or not. So this again is the three of the structures from Mezirich. This is the one from Mezin that I showed you earlier on. And the second one from Kistronki 11, layer 1A. And finally, again, Udinova. Okay, so I'm going to have to apologize. It's been quite a long time since I gave a presentation, and I'm a little bit rusty on the whole timekeeping thing. So I'm going to try and just run through this in 3 or 4 minutes, if I may, and I'll just please bear with me, and please excuse my my sort of tardiness in finishing this part of finishing this presentation. Something that we talked about in the paper, and which I just want to mention to you, because I just now want to talk about some of the kind of wider possibilities for looking at the significance of these structures and so on. Something that we talked about in the paper, and where there's more detail there if you're interested, is looking at how much meat is actually represented in each one of these structures. And the figures are there, but to to précis the whole thing, basically we came to the conclusion that if you um, suppose, for example, that there might have been 100 people present at the site, the amount of meat that's represented by a single structure would have been enough for those people to live off for, on average, something between 4 and 7 months. Okay. However, some of the structures are bigger than others. And so if you look at if you then look at that in more detail, you can say that from the smallest structures, it would be enough to feed 100 people for maybe 2 to 3 months. The largest structures would be enough to feed 100 people for maybe 6 to 10 months. So that's the kind of ballpark of what we're looking at. And the other thing that we know about Udinova is that we have some seasonality info from the mammoth milk teeth. And that suggests that calves were being killed pretty much throughout the year. Okay, so it's not like just a single season is represented there. We also have the Arctic foxes, which we can maybe presume or suppose were killed in the early winter, preferentially for their furs. And so I just want to float the idea that perhaps each structure could represent the result of like one kind of year's activity, which wouldn't have lasted necessarily an entire year, but 1 year's activity at the site. And so the mound was built with all the mammoths that had been killed that year and then was sealed off. And so I think that's an idea that can be floated and can be talked about. I'm also just want to return to the question of the dating of the site, because sorry, I only just learned this week when I was going back and looking at this again, and I was thinking, like, what's the deal with that gap between the Castrionca 11 and the other sites? And I was like, wonder what happened to the mammoths. And so I haven't, completely figured out how the debate is on this, because it's there's definitely people say various things, but certainly some people are arguing pretty solidly that the mammoths were not in fact present in Europe at the height of the LGM, which I didn't even realize. And so you can see, so sorry, the chronology here is reversed from where it was earlier on. But you can see between the earlier site and the later group of sites, right in between that, if you look down at the bottom of the screen, the grey square shows where there's actually, in this study, there were no radiocarbon dates for mammoth. So there's a gap there for the LGM, and then there's the other gap, the more recent gap is for the Bowling-Alarod, which raises the question of, like, is it possible that the people who built the site at Castrionca 11 went somewhere else, like outside of Europe, and then maybe came back after the LGM? And that to me is a really intriguing possibility. But when you look at like how similar the sites are, but like right down to the arrangements of mandibles around the edges, like I think that's a really intriguing possibility. Okay, and I also just wanted to say briefly that there's probably more to be said about the distribution of the sites, how people might have been moving between different sites, using them, which group would, like, how many groups of people might there have been altogether at any one time? Like, how did all of that work? I think there's a lot more still to be done on just disentangling that. And I just also want to mention finally, so because these sites were discussed a little bit in the book The Dawn of Everything, and so Graeber and Wengrow, they brought the sites into their arguments about monumentality in the Upper Paleolithic. And to be honest, like when I first read this, I wasn't really sure about it, because I don't really tend to think very much about monuments in relation to the Upper Paleolithic, and the way I was thinking about these sites, I was kind of more focused on the process that kind of led to the building of these structures, rather than like the end results. But I don't actually know if that's fair of me, because as I was saying at the beginning, they are incredibly impressive. They are incredibly impressive structures. Like, even in the present day, even in their like deflated, um, very, you know, after thousands and thousands and thousands of years, of sitting in those, you look at them, and they're still incredibly impressive structures. So the question of monumentality and the question of how it might have been to be like living in a landscape where you had these groups of of mounds that were built out of mammoth bones. There is probably more to be said there. And I'm finally just going to leave you with, in fact, some questions, because returning to this topic, which I haven't really, to be honest, thought about much for several years. It just came, I just came back to it, and I just had more questions looking at it. So some of those are answerable, some of them are not really answerable. But just to run through them very quickly, and then I will stop and open to your questions. Is to say that there's lots of quite straightforward questions that I think we haven't really pulled all the evidence together well yet for all of the sites. So things to do with just the taphonomy of the structures, just the details of what their makeup is, and so on. Other basic things about seasonality, chronology, the other activities attested at each site. There's still stuff to be said there, and there's comparisons in particular to be made. And I also think that there might be some space for thinking more about population dynamics. I don't know if it would be possible at the current state of the art to try and bring in some of the evidence from ancient DNA and so on, to think about how big populations were, how populations were mixing at this time, and what relationships might have the people who built these structures, what relationships might they have had with people in other regions around them. And then finally, just to return to my unanswerable question, but which I've just started really thinking about, is we have this distribution like of these sites all over the Desna Dnieper basin. Does that mean there were like multiple groups of people like building these things all at the same time? Or is it like literally like one sort of large group of people that was coming together once a year, and at various different points in time, they were doing it in different parts of this region? That to me is kind of an interesting question to ponder, even if I don't think we can answer it. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you so much. And thank you for your forbearance in my running over time a little bit.
Thanks, Natasha. That was really amazing. I really, really enjoyed listening. If you want to unshare your screen, and then we can go to gallery, and then that makes it easier for me to spot people that have questions. So we actually already have a question in the chat from Chris Stringer, saying, given what we've recently heard about putrefaction, maggots, etc., so this was last week's talk from Melanie Beasley, is it possible that some of the mammoths still had brains and tongues in them and were cached to putrefy?
And we're sorry, and we're what to putrefy?
Cached, stored.
Cash to putrefy.
Yeah.
I suppose so. I mean, I can't rule it out. I mean, it seems that so the skulls were often had been broken to get the brains out, certainly at Udinova. But yes, the question of when they might have done that is not we can't tell. And then I mean, I didn't see the talk about putrefaction, so I don't really have much more to add on that. But yeah, I would say it's possible. Yeah, it's possible. And I'd love to know if that's what Alex Pryor's been thinking about a little bit as well. Yeah, but unfortunately I can't really answer that question very satisfactorily. But
Yeah, I
thank
guess
you.
it's also interesting to think about, if you're saying there's this much meat, whether they're being killed in one go, or if they are being killed in one go, that's a lot of meat to store for a long period of time, and that might lead to some of the putrefaction or possibly things like that.
Yeah, and it would be a really interesting thing to look for solid evidence of as well.
Mhm.
Yeah.
We have a question from John Gowlett in the chat as well, saying, very interesting talk, thanks. Is there enough evidence remaining to show that painting was common?
Um, as in painting of the bones, I presume.
Yeah.
Um, it was, I mean, I don't think it's not found at every site, but it's, I mean, the at Mezin and Mezirich, there's, some really, really nice examples of it. Um, but I think it's not found at every site. And I guess like just the differences in burial conditions between different sites means you wouldn't necessarily find it everywhere. Um, but yeah, it's well attested, certainly at those two sites at least, and probably elsewhere.
Thanks. I had a question. Do you think that there's a possibility that if they were dwelling structures, that they may not have fires in because they don't need the fire in, and they may be warm enough by themselves?
No. No, I don't know. Like I've been in some unheated tents in the past, and I mean I don't know. I'd be interested to know your thoughts on this. More than anything is what do you reckon? Do you think that's feasible?
I think it would depend what they're covered in.
Okay.
For example, you see some Inuit groups that use whalebone as structural material, and then they're covered in lots of layers of sod and snow and earth and stuff, which I guess perhaps may be warmer than if you're just covering it in skins. But I'm not sure. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, it was pretty cold. It was,
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, just before, just after the LGM, like it wasn't I guess if you had enough people in there, maybe it would be all right, keeping each other warm and some nice wolf dogs or something as well. But yeah, I I find it difficult to imagine, but like that can just be my own preconceptions.
No, I follow. I follow.
Hours.
Right, we've just hit 3 o'clock. We've got a lot of people in the chat saying thanks for a great talk, and I really echo that. I really, really enjoyed it. It was really interesting to listen to. Um, uh, there's a comment from Sue, um, but as we've just hit three, I would suggest perhaps if you could email, perhaps. Um, oh, perfect.
Thank you for the comments.
But yes, this was absolutely fabulous. And thank you, everybody, for listening in. It's been really great to have you, as always.
All right. Thank you so much again.
Thanks.
Thanks. Bye.